Thanks, everybody, for coming today. I'm Ken Luongo. I'm the president of the Partnership for Global Security, and I'm going to moderate today's event. What we're going to be doing today is assessing the Obama nuclear legacy, but not just Obama's nuclear legacy, but how the global community in general is dealing with very important nuclear issues. We're at a crossroads in the sense that there's only 18 months or 20 months left in this administration, and we have a final nuclear security summit coming up next spring here in the United States. We're not sure where it will be, but it'll be here in the United States, probably either here or Chicago. A lot of attention the last several weeks, if not months, has been placed on the Iran deal and the importance of that for the Obama legacy. But in fact, the nuclear security summits are the president's own initiative, and I think equally important to his legacy, to whatever the outcome is going to be in Iran. According to Obama himself, in his own words, he says the thing that keeps him up at night is the prospect of nuclear terrorism. So this is an issue which is, I think, very near to the administration's heart. It's certainly very important to us. The summit process has been going on now for several years. It began in 2010 in Washington, then in Seoul in 2012, then in The Hague in 2014. So we have only one more to go, and I think we have to make sure that we're going to do as much as possible to strengthen the barriers to the potential for nuclear terrorism, and in general, as nuclear technology spreads, make sure that the system for controlling it and managing it and safety and security is as strong as possible. Work on the summit has already begun. There have been 2 meetings of the Sherpas, who are the international team that prepare the work for the leaders. These summits have been held at the head of state level, and so they're very high level. They are equal to what happens at the G8. They're equal to what happens in the economic sphere. The last meeting was the first one was in October here in Washington. The second one was in February, I think, in Thailand. There'll be a next one will be in June. So the question is whether or not what those Sherpas and what those international teams are doing is going to be adequate for the task that we face. And at the moment, the core of what the official process seems to be focused on is creating 5 action plans to try and determine how they're going to be able to incorporate some of the summit's unique features into pre-existing institutions. And those institutions that they've identified, I think these have been identified publicly in the last 2 days as part of the Carnegie Conference, are the International Atomic Energy Agency, the United Nations, the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, Interpol, and the G8. My impression of those working groups or those action plans are that they're very institutionally based. And what we're here to talk about is less institutionally focused and more focused on what we want as the outcome from this summit. So I need my props. I draw your attention to this document, which is the 5 priorities that is a consensus document of major U.S. and international expert organizations. These are the issues that we would like. So there are 5 action plans that are institutionally based. These are 5 substantive goals that we have for the summit. If they can be merged, that would be ideal, but I think if it's just institutionally focused, I think that would be a mistake. So I just run through them very quickly. Make the global nuclear security regime comprehensive. We're going to hear a lot about that today. Share information to build global confidence. We're also going to hear about that today. Implement measurable best practices and standards. Amazingly, we're also going to hear about that today. Create a mechanism for continuous progress. We'll also hear about that. Offering plans for eliminating civil HEU and reducing plutonium, we will not hear about today unless it's raised by your questions, which we're happy to entertain. So there's basically two items that we are going to unveil today and talk about. The first is this document, International Convention on Nuclear Security. This is a document which has been produced by 4 truly excellent and expert authors, having backgrounds in international law, international diplomacy, the International Atomic Energy Agency, U.S. government, both in diplomacy and in intelligence. So this is not a document which was created in the ivory tower. This is a document which has been created by people with real experience and that have real concerns about the state of the nuclear security regime today. It is something that you'll hear 3 of our speakers talk about. It is, I would say, the next iteration of initiative that was launched at the summit last year in The Hague, which was on an initiative of the Dutch and the South Koreans and the Americans, which then had 35 other countries sign up to it, or 35 total countries sign up to it, which was on the implementation of recommendations from the International Atomic Energy Agency and additional beyond what the IAEA has suggested. It was, for shorthand purposes, called the Trilateral Initiative. And it's gone, I think this is an important fact, it started as an initiative of the summit, which in the summit has a very limited number of countries, around 50 or so countries in it. It has now been transformed into a document of the International Atomic Energy Agency where any country that's a member state of the IAEA can sign on to. So we're hoping that this initiative on nuclear security implementation, which is a foundation for this International Convention on Nuclear Security, will gather additional signatories in Vienna over the course of the next few months leading up to the summit. The second thing that we're going to talk about today is one of the truly unique features of the summit process itself, which is the offering of voluntary commitments to take action both either individually, what were called gift baskets in 2010, or in groups, multilaterally, in what are called, what was the first one? First one was called house gifts. House gifts in 2010, and then beginning in 2012, gift baskets. So this is a report from our organization, the Partnership for Global Security, and the Arms Control Association on implementation of these gift baskets. And this is one in a series. There will be one more before the summit. But this is the kind of unique feature of the summit that needs to be preserved. And if you take the summit unique features and try to insert them into existing institutions that don't have these as part of their charter or their basis or their mandate, I think it's going to be very hard to sustain. So essentially what we're arguing for today is a continuation of a political track on nuclear security which complements the technical track. And to do that, we have 4 excellent speakers today. The first is Michelle Kahn. And Michelle is a senior budget and policy analyst at the Partnership for Global Security, where she focuses on analyzing the evolution of global nuclear security policies and new approaches to transnational security issues. Her background is in international science and technology. Michelle is going to talk about the new ACA PGS report. We're then going to have 3 speakers on the convention in the following order. First, Ken Brill. Ken served as the founding director of the U.S. National Counterproliferation Center and ambassador to the IAEA for the United States during his 35-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service. He's been involved with negotiations of the Vienna Convention on the ozone layer, which is very relevant to this convention, and is on the Stimson Center's board of directors He also led the Fund for Peace for 2 years. He'll be followed by Ambassador John Bernhard. Ambassador Bernhard served as the ambassador of Denmark to the IEA and also to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Also the countries of the Netherlands, Spain, Venezuela. He's a member of the IEA Board of Governors and also vice chairman of the IEA Board. And our fourth speaker will be Dr. Chang-Hoon Shin. Dr. Shin is the director of the Center for Global Governance in the International Law and Conflict Resolution Program and Nuclear Policy and Technology Program at the Asan Institute for International Policy in the Republic of Korea. He specializes in law of the sea, international environmental law, international humanitarian law, and law and policy on nonproliferation. The way we're going to operate is to have every speaker go in turn, and then we will save questions for the end. I'll be the moderator. We ask that when you want to ask a question, just raise your hand. Someone, Amber, will come around. Who's Amber coming around with? Amber just raised her hand. She will come around with the microphone. Please state your name and your affiliation, and then speak into the mic because it's being recorded. Thank you. With that, we'll start with Michelle.
Okay. Well, it's great to see everyone here today. We're really excited to have everyone out to talk about what are we doing after 2016. So I'm starting off with the voluntary commitments. This is the fifth in the series of reports that we started back in 2010 to try to look at the summits and say materially what is coming out of them. What are the tangible near-term impacts that these summits are having? And so we started with this in 2010 with national commitments, and this issue has grown to be multilateral commitments in Seoul, The Hague, and we expect some more when it comes back to Washington or Chicago in 2016. Now, voluntary commitments are an increasingly common way of addressing transnational issues. Voluntary commitments aren't unique to the summit process, but voluntary commitments on nuclear security, on the scale, the impact, and the frequency that we've seen over the last several years are. And that's why we consider this one of the chief innovations of the summit process. But we see this in other fields too. For instance, climate change is one where we're seeing voluntary commitments really start to make an impact. You have companies, you have cities, municipalities, whole countries make voluntary commitments of how they're going to cut their carbon emissions, increase energy efficiency, pursue their mandates in just a more sustainable way. And later this year, there's going to be the climate conference in Paris. And in addition to a follow-on to Kyoto, we're really expecting that some of the voluntary commitments that countries are working on right now to be part of the major outcomes of the summit. Now, this is very similar to the Nuclear Security Summit in that these voluntary commitments are what have made headlines. When you hear what the big things that happened at the summit are, yes, there was a communique, but those snippets about the material removals, the education initiatives, the things that are going to be longer lasting or that are making a big impact have to do with these voluntary initiatives. But unlike the climate conferences, which are institutionally grounded, there's not going to be another summit in the current form and timetable after 2016. We're a little sheepish to say whether this is the final summit, but we know that we're not going to have these heads of state gatherings bringing this type of attention to this issue again after the Washington one. So there's a legitimate concern that these high-level, regular, time-bound commitments might fall off for nuclear security. So commitment making has evolved considerably over these last few years, and those that are made in 2016 really have the potential to make a lasting legacy for this summit process. When states first came to Washington, they were encouraged to bring a house gift, a commitment of how they were actually implementing the ideals that were in the communique and part of the summit process. We had things like establishing centers of excellence for national and regional training and education. We had updates of national laws and legislation, countries committed to ratifying international treaties, and we had a lot of commitments to secure materials, repatriate materials, a lot of activities that had been in the pipeline of wish lists on the nuclear security community, but were slowly chugging along. The summit really gave an opportunity to accelerate these efforts. Now, a lot of these repatriation efforts and conversion efforts and security efforts, they were pledged by one country, but they involved several countries or institutions to get them done. For instance, Ukraine was one of the countries that pledged to remove its HEU. It was Ukraine's national commitment, but it involved the US, the IAEA, and Russia, all working together to get this done. In Seoul, this kind of multilateral character of these commitments was better recognized in the gift baskets. We still had countries pledging to do specific things on their own, but we had a lot of countries get together and say exactly how they were going to cooperate on key areas within the summit process. So countries got together and they put together gift baskets on transport security, LEU fuel production, radiological security, national legislation implementation kits. Individual countries led them, but several countries got behind to make them happen. Now, these gift baskets don't have a set structure or form or predetermined reporting format or schedule. But the 2014 summit really acted as an opportunity for countries to update each other on how they had actually implemented these commitments and how they were going to build on them. So when countries came to The Hague, about half of the 14 gift baskets that were offered were actually updates to the ones from 2012. And in 2016, we're expecting more of this. Follow up on the existing gift baskets and new ones that will take the regime further. But with no summits to follow after 2016, there's a real question on how countries are going to be held accountable for the commitments that they do make in 2016, and whether this type of high-level commitment making is going to translate into another international forum. So Ken mentioned one in particular gift basket that was given in 2016, which was the Strengthening Nuclear Security Implementation Initiative. Now, this gift basket, plus this precedent of building each time on previous gift baskets, gives us hope and one path forward where we can see there might be a successor and some of the innovations of the summit process preserved. So this initiative, this Strengthening Nuclear Security Implementation, was one of the most popular gift baskets given. We had 35 states sign on to it, which was 2/3 of the participants of the summit process. These states committed to fully implement the IAEA's key nuclear and radiological security recommendations, to conduct self-assessments in terms of peer review or IPASS missions, and to ensure that the nuclear security personnel in their countries were demonstrably competent. In the fall, that gift basket was submitted to the IAEA, and it's now known as Information Circular 869, and open to all states for signature. Now, this guarantees that this initiative is going to outlive the summit process. Now, today we don't have new signatories from the IAEA on it, but the countries that signed on it at the last summit are working on this, and we hope to see some more countries get involved soon. So in addition to increasing the number of signatures on this initiative, we also want to see that its demonstrations of how countries are implementing it. And this can really have a major positive impact on how countries share information to build confidence in their national systems and how these fit together into the global system. So building on this gift basket in 2016, as was done for 8 of the 13 gift baskets that were given in 2012, in 2014, has the real potential to help make the ideals and the innovations and some of the ideas that have taken hold during the summit process outlive it. So the outcomes in 2016 are going to have a major impact on the trajectory of the nuclear security regime for years to come. And from writing these reports, the one thing that we have found that has been constant throughout these commitments is that the gift baskets that clearly define what they want the outcome to be and how they're going to do them are the ones that are most successful. Where communiques really represent a lot of the foundational ideas that everyone can get behind, the gift baskets and voluntary commitments show how countries are acting on them. Most of the commitments, national and multinational, with the exception of the Strengthening Nuclear Security Implementation one, have been pretty narrowly focused. And in 2016, we need to break out of that mold and have a little more broadly conceived, forward-looking gift basket. Currently, we have a summit whose legacy is rather backward-looking. We have a lot of material removals and ideas that had been in process for a while, and not a lot of things that are actually going to outlive the process and change the way the nuclear security regime functions going forward. Now, there are some really important achievements that will carry on, and those include the national legislation improvements that countries have undertaken, and a lot of the training and the security and training, education, security kind of centers that have been established. But when the summits end in 2016, the system itself isn't going to be materially different than it was in 2010 when these were started. And we have to ask ourselves, is that what we want? Have we actually done enough to make the need that existed in 2010 for these summits no longer relevant? Have the threats changed? Have the dispersion of materials changed enough where that we're comfortable with the system we have is going to control things going forward? So one way to ensure that we stay on this path of continuous improvement that the summits have set us on is to use these gift baskets, or at least one in 2016, as a tool to start mending the regime and start to deal with a successor to the summits that is going to keep this type of high-level attention. So we'll hear now from some of my colleagues in the NSGEG who have an idea of what that looks like. Thank you.
Well, let me add my welcome to that of Ken's and Michelle's. But let me also thank Michelle for asking that question. And we look forward to answering it as we go forward. What I want to do right now is outline 10 reasons why it is essential and urgent to strengthen sustainably the global nuclear security regime. The first of these reasons, which seems obvious to this group, but it's not always obvious to people outside this room, is that nuclear terrorism is very real. The threat exists, it's real, and it's dynamic. Multiple terrorist groups have demonstrated their interest in acquiring and using nuclear materials for attack purposes, and this includes the so-called Islamic State, the most recent of the terrorist groups to express interest in weapons of mass destruction and nuclear materials in particular. Second, a nuclear terrorist attack would produce catastrophic humanitarian and economic consequences where it occurred, as well as globally. Nuclear terrorism is also likely to produce long-term political and security changes in the nation affected, at the national level, and at the global level. And I think it's fair to say that few today would want to see these kinds of changes, and fewer still would think that these changes would be positive, that they would want to do them in the absence of nuclear terrorism. So in sum, nuclear terrorism must be prevented because there is no response that could really undo the pervasive damage that would happen to individuals, societies, and global institutions of governance and security. Third, nuclear and other radioactive materials are subject to loss, theft, and illicit trafficking. Over a 10-year period, the IAEA has confirmed some 2,500 incidents related to the theft, loss of control, unauthorized possession, or illicit trafficking in these materials. Now, most of these cases were involving radiological materials, but in at least 18 cases, weapons-grade fissile material was the subject of the incident. The fourth reason is the growing demand for nuclear energy, both for power production and for a variety of industrial, medical, and research uses, means that in the future there will be more nuclear material that needs to be secured than there is today. The fifth reason is that the material for nuclear terrorism is essentially man-made and is not found in nature. So if you reduce the amount of such material and secure what is left so that terrorists cannot get their hands on it, there cannot be nuclear terrorism. There will be no nuclear terrorism, full stop. But sixth, the global regime for securing what many people, political leaders and experts alike, have called among the most dangerous materials in the world, the regime to control these or to secure them is, in fact, a patchwork of largely voluntary arrangements and initiatives. The IAEA, for example, can only do what member states allow it to do. And for nuclear security, it has no legal mandate to require actions of its member states related to nuclear security. It can, however, provide advice and make recommendations. Other initiatives, such as the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, are also essentially voluntary in nature. The World Institute for Nuclear Security focuses on practical steps that industries can take to improve and enhance their own nuclear security practices. But again, these recommendations are advisory in nature. There are 2 narrowly focused and specialized treaties and 3 UN Security Council resolutions that bear on the issue of nuclear security, and they're helpful, but they have limited operational application to actually securing nuclear material. Seventh, the patchwork nature of the global approach to nuclear security leaves significant gaps that create opportunities terrorists can exploit as they seek to acquire material. The first of these gaps, and I'll mention just 3, is that there are no binding standards globally for securing nuclear material and other radioactive materials. So no standards for how to secure the most dangerous materials in the world. Second, there's no process, no international process for assessments or peer reviews of nuclear security practices. In other words, how is nuclear security implemented? There's no way to assess that. Third, and the last of the gaps I'll mention today, is there's no mechanism to provide sustained attention to the nuclear security regime or to make and implement improvements to that regime over time. Now, many people outside this room would assume the IAEA is taking care of these functions, that it's not an issue that needs to be dealt with. But as I've noted earlier, the IAEA has no legal mandate to do so. It can only provide advice. The Nuclear Threat Initiative's Nuclear Securities Material Index shows that global nuclear security practices vary among the 25 states with bomb-grade material. And I think it's fair to say the variation among those securing radiological material is even wider. These variations in how people secure these dangerous materials, again, produce the opportunities for terrorists who seek to acquire them. The unexplained 2007 raid on South Africa's highly enriched uranium storage site at Pelindaba demonstrates the need for enhancing global nuclear security, as do the 2 subsequent security incidents at that site, the most recent of which was in 2013. And the 2012 break-in at the American nuclear site Y-12 by a geriatric group of peace activists is a similar example of failed nuclear security that is much closer to home. Eighth, and as you've already heard from the 2 previous speakers, the Nuclear Security Summit process is coming to an end. President Obama's initiative to launch the summit process showed vision and it offered promise. To its credit, as a result of the Nuclear Security Summit process, 12 countries have eliminated their stocks of weapons-grade material. The Washington, Seoul, and Hague summits have also produced useful initiatives to improve nuclear security more generally. But all these initiatives are voluntary, and states may or may not implement them, and more importantly, they may or may not sustain them over time. Now, all indications are that the next Nuclear Security Summit will hand back the nuclear security issue to the institutions and initiatives that existed at the time the summit process started. Back to the Future is a nice theme for a movie, but I'm not sure it's the right approach for securing the world's most dangerous materials. The NSS process, the Nuclear Security Summit process, began because the status quo at the time was considered to be inadequate to meet the need to prevent nuclear terrorism. Returning to what was deemed to be inadequate in the past doesn't give one great confidence that we will prevent nuclear terrorism in the future. Filling the gaps that I identified earlier, the lack of standards, the lack of assessments, and the lack of a mechanism to provide sustained oversight of the regime are essential to a nuclear security regime that is as dynamic as the threat it's trying to prevent. 10th, and finally, to defeat terrorist goals and prevent nuclear terrorism, we must have a global nuclear security regime commensurate with both the risks and the consequences of nuclear terrorism, which the current regime simply is not. In speaking recently about nuclear challenges, former Secretary of State George Shultz said, "We as a country, but also we as a global society, spend far too much time on what is and not enough time on what ought to be." And speaking in the same context, former Secretary of State Kissinger said that if there were a nuclear event, it's inevitable dramatic change would be made globally afterwards. And the question, he said, is can we prove we are smart enough to keep that kind of thing from happening, to do now what we would have done afterwards? I think clearly the time is here to prove that we are smart enough to move the is of nuclear security very much closer to the what ought to be. And I'll leave to my colleague, Ambassador Bernhard, to tell you how we plan to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. To start with, I want to say that we see this convention as the most efficient, direct, and responsible way to address the weaknesses of the current international regime, which has just been described, and also as a follow-up to the Nuclear Security Summit process. You will find the text and an introduction to the text of the convention in a booklet on the table here in front. But I would like briefly to outline the main objectives and content of the International Convention on Nuclear Security, which we then launch today. Firstly, it fills one of the most obvious gaps in today's regime. As Ken just mentioned, there are no common legally binding standards for securing nuclear and other radioactive material and associated facilities. This is a surprising fact, and there is obviously a need to establish such standards against which the performance of states can be measured by the states themselves and by peer reviews. The convention introduces a set of such common and legally binding standards in its annex under the title Essential Elements of a National Nuclear Security Regime. Where do these elements or standards come from? They actually already exist. We didn't invent them. They exist as they are the result of negotiations among the IAEA member states. That means more than 150 states. And they were endorsed by the decision-making organs of the IAEA in 2012. By the Board of Governors and the General Conference. So if states are already familiar with the standards. Why repeat them here in the convention? Well, the answer is that though they were adopted in the IEA, they are only politically binding norms, which states may or may not implement. States are not obliged to do it. By inserting them in the convention, they are converted into legally binding rules, which will be compulsory for states parties to this convention to implement. So they are moved to a higher level of commitment. The second very important feature of this convention is the establishment of the Conference of the Parties, the COP, which is an expression known also from other international treaties. The COP will be responsible for the continuous improvement and development of the international nuclear security regime, and its very comprehensive mandate is of crucial importance for the attention to nuclear security issues, which is and will be needed also after the end of the summit process. The role of the Conference of the Parties will include both oversight of the implementation of the convention and more generally review, discussion and assessment of the effectiveness of the international nuclear security regime. The COP will have a dynamic role as well when it comes to identifying gaps in the regime, new gaps which are discovered, and how to address them. For example, or typically by adopting protocols to the convention. Adoption of protocols to the convention will be a way to continuously improve and develop the international regime, a process which the states themselves are masters of through negotiations and decisions at the meetings of the COP. In other words, the convention leaves the responsibility for the further strengthening of the nuclear regime to the states parties to the COP and to the convention assembled in the Conference of the Parties. And in this way, the convention should be seen as a living document. It contains some basic principles, some very necessary basic elements, but whether and when there is a need for additional rules will be up to the Conference of the Parties to decide. The role of the COP is also decisive with regard to the reports from state parties about their national nuclear security regimes, which the Convention foresees. The COP will adopt the procedures and mechanisms for this, and it is provided that these procedures and mechanisms, of course, should protect the confidentiality of sensitive information. As it is expected that the Nuclear Security Summit process will end in 2016, a critical question is what comes after it, how to establish an effective and ambitious follow-up process. We think that the best answer to this question is the Convention and its Conference of the Parties, which can, in effect, succeed the Nuclear Security Summit process by providing a forum for examining and developing the nuclear security regime as a whole. Differently from the Nuclear Security Summit process, however, the Convention and its mechanisms will be open to all states which are ready to contribute to the strengthening of nuclear security. This is essential, as we see it, because a universal threat like nuclear terrorism requires universal solutions. Therefore, the Convention has the potential of becoming a universal instrument. It may take time before broad acceptance of the idea of a convention is achieved and before the convention text is negotiated and adopted. But even if the initial support for and action on a convention may come from a relatively small group of states, like 20 to 25, experience from other important international treaties, such as, for example, the Vienna Convention and Montreal Protocol on the ozone layer, shows that it may soon grow into a universal convention. In the meantime, it is essential to continue to effectively implement and strengthen the current nuclear security instruments. For example, by bringing the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and its amendment into effect, and by continuing the efforts in international organizations and groups, in particular the IAEA. In this regard, it's important to stress that the Convention does not affect or replace any of the existing instruments or processes. What it does is to supplement them and to create a mechanism to develop and strengthen the international regime further without creating any new international bureaucracy. To sum up, the Convention is ambitious, we think, but also realistic, as it recognizes that states may not be ready to enter into a large number of new international obligations here and now. Therefore, the future development and strengthening of nuclear security lies in the hands of states assembled in the Conference of the Parties. The nuclear terrorist threat is dynamic, and the Convention will lay the foundation for the dynamism that the nuclear security regime needs also after the end of the nuclear summit process. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to pay special thanks to Dr. Chen for his attendance at this of this meeting. Well, actually, Dr. Chen was the top secretary for national security and foreign affairs at the Office of President when 2012 Seoul Nuclear Security Summit took place. Today, I'm mandated to talk about regional implication of this proposed International Convention on Nuclear Security. As you may know, I'm a member of this drafting team from South Korea, regionally from Northeast Asia. So I can't help talking about the possible North Korea's illicit trafficking in nuclear materials or weapons, sensitive technologies, which poses serious threats to the global nuclear security architecture. Let me begin with untold nuclear threats posed by North Korea in Northeast Asia. The proliferation of nuclear weapons or fissile materials by North Korea to and from non-state actors has not been seriously discussed in any forum so far. The possible involvement of North Korea in the smuggling of nuclear materials as a supplier state, a broker, or an end user were not discussed. However, the concerns over terrorist groups as a supplier, broker, or end users were well articulated by William Porter. I will talk about North Korea's factor in the region as a possible supplier, broker, or end user. Though there has been no smoking guns over them. As a supplier, North Korea will be keen to sell its know-how and technology, or so-called intangibles of nuclear weapons or delivery means, rather than selling its nuclear materials or weapons themselves. As a broker, North Korea will be keen to revive A.Q. Khan's so-called nuclear supplier ring to sell weapons and materials to non-state actors. As an end user, the loose nuclear materials from the territories of the former Soviet Union may be the target of smuggling by North Korea. If the loose materials were smuggled into North Korea, our estimates of North Korea's stockpile of weapon-usable nuclear materials could be totally wrong. Even the estimates of warheads would be significantly wrong, which would pose new threats to the regional and international peace and security. To make matters worse, if it is true, as argued by some nuclear experts, that North Korea succeeded in developing a uranium gun-type device in conjunction with already smuggled HEU, North Korea will have greater potential to be a supplier of these devices to terrorist groups. Ladies and gentlemen, a strong proponent of nuclear security, Professor Matt Ben, argues that nuclear security is the foundation for the three pillars, non-proliferation, disarmament, and the peaceful uses of nuclear energy of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The argument implies, whether intended or not by him, that the issue of nuclear security may be explored within the framework of the NPT. However, on the other hand, there may be an argument that the issue of nuclear security should be discussed in other fora because the nuclear materials of de facto nuclear weapon states or challenging states to the NPT regime will be ruled out. The fora held outside the NPT regime include the nuclear security summits and the negotiations on the fissile material cutting off treaty. Fortunately, the two fora outside the NPT regime have achieved significant improvements, particularly in raising the awareness of the significance of the control over nuclear or fissile materials. However, the scope of the materials that the summits have dealt with were confined to civilian nuclear materials, while the Seoul and the Hague summits broadened that scope from nuclear materials to radiological sources. On the other hand, another difference between the summits and the FMCT is that the summits deal with the control over existing nuclear materials, while the fissile material cutting off treaty deals with future production of fissile materials. Now, let me get back to our business, International Convention on Nuclear Security. The proposed International Convention on Nuclear Security, introduced by the Nuclear Security Governance Experts Group, is the product of brainstorming exercise that has sought to fill the gap among the fragmented elements of our global nuclear security architecture. However, taking an incremental approach, the scope of materials that the proposed convention covers may be decided by the parties to the convention through the establishment of Conference of Parties. Additionally, a protocol to the convention may be agreed upon by the parties to deal with nuclear materials for military uses. Whether or not nuclear security is discussed within the framework of the NPT, it is clear that a successful nuclear security regime strengthens the three pillars of the NPT. If the proposed convention is widely endorsed by the members of our international community, along with the FMCT, and the scope of nuclear materials expanded to materials related to military uses, the proposed convention will help further regional peace and security, as well as contribute to stability on the Korean Peninsula. The proposed International Convention on Nuclear Security and the Fissile Material Cutting Off Treaty are complementary to each other in achieving a complete and sustainable control over nuclear or fissile materials. It is interesting that some scholars put forward an idea of framework convention on fissile materials as a solution to ending the stalemate negotiations on the Fissile Materials Cutting Off Treaty. In addition, they claimed that the Fissile Material Cutting Off Treaty orphan may serve well as a nuclear security bellwether. In that sense, the international community stands at a critical point where it is desirable and necessary to devise a sustainable nuclear security regime after the year 2016, when the Nuclear Security Summit ends. However, if you support this proposed convention, we may say that the proposed convention may serve well as bellwether of ending the stalemate of the Fissile Material Cutting Off Treaty. The efforts to secure nuclear materials through voluntary measures cannot be blamed for being too modest, but more ambitious strategic thinking is urgently needed given the compelling progress and stalemate of the Fissile Material Cutting Off Treaties negotiations. This will become even more clear when the international community examines the issue from the regional context. The format of the regional response to nuclear terrorism may differ depending upon the geopolitical situation of the regions. The regions most vulnerable to nuclear terrorism may include South Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Northeast Asia. In a conclusion, I would like to say the real stability, particularly in Northeast Asia, may only be achieved through the concerted cooperation among the regional states bound by the legal obligations proposed by this convention. And the door to the accession to this convention will also be widely open to North Korea. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you everybody for your great presentations. We have some time for questions. If people have questions about the convention or about the summit or about the gift baskets or about the NCAA or whatever happens to be on your minds. Samantha, please use the mic and
Hi, thank you. This is Samantha Pitts-Kiefer from the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Actually, this is a very quick question about Article 6, Paragraph 1. In the context of the summit, the issue of peer review has been a big topic, especially the IEA options for peer review, including the International Physical Protection Advisory Service reviews. And I think Michelle mentioned that earlier. Is Article 6, Paragraph 1, which talks about regular assessment of the effectiveness of security, meant to also include peer review or just self-assessments? As a lawyer, I could read it both ways, but I wanted to get, understand your intention with that paragraph.
You speaking to, use the mic.
Well, it's Article 6, Paragraph 1 is an obligation for states to review their own system, first of all. And then what we foresee is that the Conference of the Parties will establish a system where peer review reporting to the Conference of the Parties somehow according to rules created by the Conference of Parties will then lead to the more ambitious part of it, peer review.
But if I might add, I'm not a lawyer, so I hesitate to drift into this. But if you read Articles 2 and 3, I think in a way it answers your question. It says we shall have these things, and here's some ways we're going to go about it. But again, it's up to the Conference of the Parties as to what the actual shape is like. But you have an institution that exists that can drive this process, but it's not an outside bureaucratic organization telling states what to do. It's states talking to each other.
Okay, may I add? So if you read the paragraph 6 of Article 9, it clearly stipulates subsidiary bodies may be established by the Conference of the Parties. So this is kind of, establishment of peer review systems.
Okay, additional questions? Yeah, Andy. I'm going to make you walk from one end of the room to the other, Amber. It's good exercise, exactly. It's like a tennis match.
Andy Selma from the Partnership for Secure America. This is terrific, I think. It's a really good idea, and it's long overdue. Congratulations. I wanted to ask the next question in terms of, I've been on commissions where we've generated wonderful ideas, and the ideas sit there, and there's no follow-through, or there's an inadequate follow-through. And so I wonder if the next commission or group needs to develop a strategy for giving this convention legs, so that it actually gets into the some document in the summit and beyond.
Yeah, let me just say one word that I neglected to say at the introduction, which is that this convention is a product of the Nuclear Security Governance Experts Group, which is a group of 25 or so international experts from around the world that have been together for the last, since right after the 2012 summit in Seoul. And so there will be a strategy, at least for others to talk about it in more detail, but it's a commission in the sense that it's a group of people, but it has been an organization that is very much committed to translating its ideas, the ideas of its members, into action. And as a member of the group, Andy, I would imagine that you have had experience. John.
Thank you. Well, it's true that the moment of truth comes afterwards. When you have produced something like this, the importance is that it has an impact and it doesn't just evaporate. And the challenge, of course, is from now on to work for states, at least a certain number of states, to endorse the idea, to support it, and to create sufficient background for bringing it forward. We are, of course, at the beginning of that strategy, but basically you could, there are three options where you could find a venue for working on this text. One could be the IAEA, the other one the UN. The third one, which is also known from other examples, is that a group of states themselves, to start with, work with a text and then maybe attract others and end up in the framework of an organization. The main thing is to spread the good news to states that here we have a good solution for you, and try to follow up on that. Thank you.
Yes, Chen. Could you just wait for and introduce yourself, please?
Well, I'm Chen Young-woo, former National Security Advisor of the Republic of Korea, and I was involved in preparing for the Seoul summit. Well, I have a question on Article 3, and my reading of my interpretation of the Article 3 is that fissile materials for non-civil purposes will be within the scope of the convention only on a voluntary basis. Is that correct? And if that's so, how many countries in possession of fissile materials for military purposes will voluntarily submit their materials to the convention? So that's and if there are not enough countries which will be willing to put their fissile materials under the scope of the convention, what would be the prospects of achieving the effectiveness or the intended objectives of the convention? That's one question. And another one is that I think I heard wrong, but Dr. Sin, did you say that this will be open to North Korea as well? So, well, under current international law, special legislation, Security Council resolutions applicable to North Korea is kind of special legislation that's applicable only to North Korea in the world. The only country in the world which is banned to possess fissile material is North Korea. All other countries in the world may be entitled to possess as long as they are under safeguards. But in the case of North Korea, the possession of fissile material itself is prohibited. So what implications do you think it will have to imply that this is open to North Korea? Are we going to legitimize North Korea's possession of fissile material, which under current international it would be prohibited?
Should we start with the second?
Yeah, start with the second question, Chang Hoon.
Okay, yes. Well, actually, when it comes to the scope, I think, your two questions that are closely related to my answers, because, we are really, cautious about drafting this scope issues, because whether we include military materials or not. But however, we decided to take incremental approaches. So let us start with including just civilian nuclear materials and facilities. But as I said, it includes not only nuclear materials, but also facilities and technologies, equipment and technologies. Is it true? Oh,
let me just jump in there to say that with regard to your question on Article 3, we drafted this in part because this idea of a convention to kick around for a little bit, and some people go, oh, it's like this dark monster under the bed. Oh my God, it must be so terrible. So we drafted this document to demonstrate that it isn't really a frightening thing, and it isn't something that's beyond the scope of nation states or even people to organize and make work. And Article 3 was written the way it is because we know military material is quite controversial in some places. We didn't want to ignore it. We thought this, frankly, we think that military material should be included, and we think there are ways to do that protect all nuclear security implications of that. I'm very sensitive to that myself, based on my own career. But we left the door open here. It's up to the state parties to walk through the door, but Article 3 leaves the door open, and there's nothing in here that would validate North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. Believe me, there's nothing there, and I'm sure the state parties wouldn't do that either.
Oh, yes. And the second question is, there must be certain conditions. If North Korea do not abandon its nuclear weapon programs, then we may not say that this convention is open to North Korea. But North Korea will convert any military, nuclear facilities into, peaceful use of nuclear energies, then it is wide open to North Korea.
Okay, yes, sir? Wait for the mic, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Scott Spence from Vertic. I asked Anita this privately, but thought maybe it would be worth asking publicly this question as well. And I ask because, how do I put this delicately? There was a bit of resistance to the National Legislation Kit on Nuclear Security, which I drafted for the Indonesians. And I'm just wondering what the IAEA's response has been to this initiative. I hope positive. I hope more positive than I encountered, but this is a very sensitive issue, I think, for the agency. Thanks.
John?
Yeah. This, I would like to answer this easy question. The fact is that we have informed the IAEA of this work going on, and last week I sent to the most relevant persons in the IAEA the result of our efforts. Of course, you could not expect any final position on that. And besides, we all have to recognize, and we do that with regard to the IAEA, that an organization can normally do what its member states want it to do. So it will, the IAEA position to it will, of course, depend on both the views of the experts within the organization, but of course also the member states' position.
I see as we get more and more into the details of this scintillating document, people are getting up and taking it off the table, so please feel free to come up and take more off the table because you'll want one, your family, your children. Everybody's going to want it, and then it'll be gone and you'll be sorry.
First edition.
First edition can be signed by the authors, indeed. Anita. She's right here. We're making it easier on you, Amber.
Yes. Yes, you hear me now.
Yes.
I wanted more to make a little comment, if I can. And that is in relation to the discussion that took place on scope and the boundaries between military use and civil uses of material. We are, of course, all of us hoping for a very obvious process in disarmament, which would generate more material coming from the military sector and moving into the civil sector. And that would also then give a larger, more pronounced function of this civil sector system and control of that. So in a way, one can say that the hope for the future evolution of material and how it exists in the world would be benefited from having a solid system to control and to catch up on also those changes. So that was one comment that I would like to do. The other one is, again, to think about the future perspective of nuclear energy use. And although this varies from region to region, how nuclear energy is seen as part of a mix in energy programs. There are certain regions of the world in which nuclear energy is clearly expanding and being used by new countries and therefore meeting new circumstances. And also in a situation like that, it seems important to have a gap-free platform upon which such new energy use is being built. And that is of course not visible in the scope here, but it has been part of the discussion that took place before all these articles, or these few articles, I would say, were put down there. So I just wanted to supplement a little bit the other purposes of this convention.
Thank you very much, Anita. For those of you who don't know, Anita is the fourth author of the convention. Additional questions, Rodrigo?
Hi, Rodrigo Alvarez from Chile. Rather than a technical question, I have a political one. According with Article 16, we are going to wait for the 22 countries accepting this convention. Then my question is, at the moment, which is the feeling about them in relation with the convention? Have we any feedback from the states that are interested to become part of the convention?
Well, I'll start, John knows to finish. This is just the beginning of this process. I mean, we are going to be developing outreach strategies, as both Ken and I think John said earlier. So we have ambitions for a lot of very active outreach to states and individuals, as well as to media and to publics. We think publics need to be aware that one, that the threat is real, two, that the system they think exists to protect them really isn't a system, and three, that there are ways to strengthen it that are reasonable, practicable, and can be done in a relatively near time if there's some energy put into it. So we're hopeful that as we begin this dialogue with states, individuals, and the public, that we can build some serious momentum to making progress.
For achieve that aim, we have a clear strategy to promote this initiative?
We have a strategy which includes contacts from now on, because we all realize that it's only now that it has been finalized and that it will be rolled out and presented to states. So we couldn't expect at this moment to have 22 states saying, yes, we'll buy that. But the strategy is to present the convention and the ideas behind it to, well, in principle, to as many states as possible who are interested, and to have a dialogue with them. This is a bid, and if a negotiation on it is starting at some point, then of course everything is up to discussion. But the idea of a convention and the main structure, that is what we are trying to promote.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Joyce Winslow. I wrote a book with the Secretary of Defense on exactly this topic, called Star Spangled Security, published through Brookings. To your question, it's obvious why we're here, as I'm a journalist here at the Press Club talking about this. Is there a strategy for getting the main idea, which is that this is needed and that the public doesn't know it's needed, to publics across the world? Because they will pressure the states.
Let me make a comment about that, and then I'll turn it over to the panel, because we are actually going to embark on a significant campaign, media campaign, to exactly demystify these 5 priorities, this document, a lot of the paper around the room is extremely complex. but it has direct relevance to people's lives and to the global population. And our goal is going to be to not try to, but to actually demystify the issues and make them more understandable to people so that they understand what's at stake. So that will be a process that begins, I don't know, probably next month or the month after, and will run up right through the summit and after the summit. And it's something that we're very, very committed to.
Actually, we think it begins Friday. John and I have an op-ed coming out in a local paper, and so you'll have a chance to see the beginning of it there. And feel free to tweet or do other kinds of social media things in support of this. The media begins here, right?
Okay, in the back.
Ray Tang from the Stanley Foundation. This question's for Michelle. The report notes several achievements from 2014. I'm wondering if there's anything in there that you consider stuck?
So I think there's one statement that we carried forward from 2012 that we included in here, despite it not having a follow-up in 2014, and that had to do with the technical project of creating HEU fuel, or LEU fuel. There's been a little bit of some technical difficulties with that. It's not something that's been abandoned, and the goal is just, the goalposts have been moved back a little bit, but it's something that's still under development and will keep going forward. And I think that's one of the challenges when you have some of these gift baskets that deal with actual technical issues rather than political commitments that you can implement with will rather than science. You can get into these situations where they might take a little bit longer than first expected. But I wouldn't call any of the gift baskets stuck or stalled. There's a few that had more defined plans than the others, and so they're held to a higher standard, right? If they say we're going to do this by this date, then we can hold them to that. The ones that get away with doing a little bit less are the ones that lack that type of specificity, but those with the specificity are really the ones that we see succeed the most.
Okay. Caroline?
Thank you. Just
You have to state who you are first.
Caroline Joran from France. As a consultant, I am. Yeah, coming back to the strategy, I was wondering whether pending the, I'm optimistic, no? So pending the entry into force of this convention, and given that the next NSS is going to be in less than 2 years' time now, probably, do you think that a strategy could be of getting a few member states adhering to the principles in that text and getting together and proposing to have an INFCIRC, this kind of, useful methods that the IAEA has or that is available at the IAEA level to publicize this and say, well, we are committed to the principles and maybe attach the text or recognize the text or some, in a way, so that already in 2016 you would have publicity on this paper as being a gift basket of the NGO community to the state community.
That's an interesting idea, Caroline, and we ought to talk more about it later. But I think optimally, based on my experience, but also having read rather widely in terms of negotiating processes, it would be really useful to have a group of states come together. We have to identify them, energize them, get them encouraged. I mean, you have 35 states in The Hague who broke consensus and came up with the initiative that was talked about earlier. So you have a collection of states that have already demonstrated their ability to go the extra mile. Perhaps there's a group within that, a subgroup within that group that's ready to go even further. But once, I think you have a stronger end result if a group of truly committed states get together, negotiate something that's reasonable and start a process, and then invite other people in and anticipate the needs of new members. Some might need technical assistance, some might need other kinds of things. You can build that into the process, and we tried to show how you could do that with this text. But if you sort of say, well, let's have everybody come in first and then we'll negotiate, you're going to get what you got out of climate change, which is, it's nice that we have these initiatives going on, but you have a very, very weak document that really isn't making change in the time scale that you need it. Much better to start small and grow, as Ozone did, where you're having dramatic impacts on a very good basis, and that started small and is now universal and is widely hailed as the most successful environmental, indeed maybe one of the most successful treaties extant. So if you can get people committed, work hard on it, they buy into it, other people join, I think you're better off.
Ken, if I recall, George Schultz's piece from the Washington Post last Sunday, in fact, referenced that as the Reagan approach to dealing with global problems. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is not something that comes from either side of the spectrum. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Audrey Williams from Partnership for a Secure America, and I have yet another question about strategy. But something I kind of starred in my notes was that the point being made that this convention kind of broadens the scope here, whereas the Nuclear Security Summit has, for various reasons, a somewhat limited number of participants. This can be more global. This can bring in some of those countries that haven't been able to be involved in the process. And so I just wondered, whether in the making of this document or now thinking about the strategy, what is going to be done to reach out to those countries that haven't been at the Nuclear Security Summit and who might even need to be convinced, as much as maybe even some of the publics, that this is an issue that they need to be working on, given that they have a lot of other pressing issues. And we've talked about how nuclear energy is expanding. There's going to be an expansion of materials and medicine across the world, and certainly in developing countries. So I was just wondering how that's playing in here and how that strategy is going to go beyond to some of these regions of the world that are starting to develop these technologies and materials. Thank you.
Well, I think I'd reiterate the point I made earlier, which is that to make this successful for the long term and to make it truly a global treaty that means something, you'd probably want to start small with those states that are most committed to the problem, that have already demonstrated their commitment by doing things about it, committing resources, committing political will, developing a convention, and then inviting others to join, and those others seeing the value added, seeing the reasons to join, do so, and make it stronger as that process goes forward. So we see this as ultimately a global treaty, but we don't think that success is necessarily advanced by beginning globally. But let's start with those who are really most concerned about it and then move forward.
Additional questions? No one looked at Article 12? I'm not sure there is an Article 12. I'm just trying to stimulate some conversation.
Coffee and dessert are over there.
Well, let me give an opportunity to the panelists to answer the kind of flip side of a lot of the questions which have been asked today, which is, what are the impediments to this? What is the text, et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to know, what is the implication of not moving forward? What is the implication of, as Andy said, if we're not able to sell this, what will the result be? I think that people need to understand what the consequences of inaction are.
Well, you want to start, John?
I just would want to start with a little bit of history about the creation of this convention. We started now a couple of years ago being maybe even more ambitious than we now ended up being, more realistic and still ambitious, I think. And what I stressed at the end of my intervention, I think, is important to note for states which think that, legally binding text is it's too early or it's going too far. When you look further into it, states will realize that it's most of all a mechanism for states themselves to decide how far they will go. It will bring common standards as a very important thing, but a lot of other things are being left to the state parties themselves. And as I think many of us think that after the Nuclear Security Summit ends, we will need some place to work on, and to a forum, a venue, and this convention creates a mechanism and a venue for further discussions to improve the system.
Can I just add a thought to that, which is that when the summit's end, and if nothing more is done, then you go back to the status quo ante. You go back to what existed before, which is a very disparate system. And I think we've all seen that the world of global terrorism is not static. It's not going back to the past. It's looking for new ways to do horrible things and create mass casualties and mass fear. And I think they're going to continue to chip away and try to find a way to acquire very dangerous materials like nuclear materials. And that the more we have a system that's patchwork and that has gaps and it looks more like a chain link fence than a wall, then we run the risk of something bad happening. And I think if you step back and asked any expert, any government expert or any technical expert, if you were going to try to prevent nuclear terrorism, what would the system look like at the global level and the national level? I don't think you'd find a single one that would design what we have today. And if there were a terrorist event, even a small-scale one, I think in 12 months, you wouldn't have the system we have today. You'd have something much more draconian. So the question is, if you know an event would change the way you do things, why not make those changes before the event to prevent it and all the negative consequences that would flow from it?
Jay, please.
Yes. When it comes to the impediment to the promotion of the International Convention on Nuclear Security, I think it's kind of a matter of priority. So even though we can sell nuclear terrorism is imminent, it never happened. So the priority really matters in the real world. So we have to, raise the awareness of the consequences of the nuclear terrorism in order to sell this kind of, convention. And when it comes to the IAEA, you questioned, the priority of the IAEA is to make, CPPNM amendments entered into force. So that's why I think, IAEA is a little bit reluctant to, endorse or accept any other international conventions. But however, I would like to put emphasis that the CPPNM is dealing with physical protection of nuclear materials, but it's not a panacea to heal all kind of, to prevent all kind of nuclear terrorisms. The Nuclear Security Summit will leave a lot of legacies, even though it's composed of lots of voluntary commitments. But we have to, continue to, keep alive this kind of legacies. The most important legacy is kind of, the like-minded states convened with each other and try to do the peer reviews reported by the individual states. So we are trying to incorporate these kind of legacies as a legal obligation in this convention. Thank you.
Michelle.
So what I wanted to add was that the summit process, countries have been developing a lot of good habits. A lot of things that did not exist as part of the way we address nuclear security before it started. Cooperation on this issue was coming in drips and drabs and a more bilateral or a few tight allies, but we really saw a lot of new coalitions form around these gift baskets, around these different issues, where countries could see on a common interest and see a value in working together. We have countries that are putting out multiple pages of national reporting at these summits about how they are addressing these issues. Now, just this level of publicly available information about the way states think about and address nuclear security wasn't around when the summit started. There's usually about a paragraph devoted to nuclear security, if that, in country statements at the IAEA General Conference. But at in the Seoul Summit and then again in the Hague Summit, we had countries really report in depth. Now, the actual level of information that they shared kind of varies, but there was definitely a learning curve where you saw countries understand a little bit better about what they were reporting on, how they fit into the system, and how their different initiatives within their countries were contributing to the global whole from Seoul to The Hague. And we can only expect that that's going to grow when this reporting goes to 2016. But what happens to it afterwards? Do we just go back to having a paragraph at the General Conference and we let these issues kind of devolve back into where they were? So I think there's cooperation, there's commitment making, there's publicly available information on a scale that didn't exist before the summit. And without this type of high-level attention that forces countries to put their information online, to make their leaders stand up and say, this is important, this is how we do it, and it's because we have a stake in the system, it's hard to see how some of the initiatives that existed before it are going to be able to pick up that mantle. Because while we say they've been empowered, none of their mandates have changed. So how differently they're actually going to be addressing this issue without that spotlight that the summit has shown on them is an open question.
Okay, any other questions that people have? Yeah, and yes, Caroline, go ahead.
Since, Ken, you invited to look at Article 12, I looked. And then I'm going to ask a question about one article which seems to be, or one part of article which seems to be missing for me. This is early implementation. I think with the 205 amendment to the Convention on Physical Protection, we are stuck with not enough member states having signed and ratified this convention, and so we are nowhere with it because there is no implementation mechanism before. And I think it would be interesting maybe to integrate some early implementation so that a few were members than the 22 that you envisaged to have it ratified, entered into force, could already start something like peer reviews and, show that finally, rather than the legal issue, the most important thing is the action, what they do, what they take, how they implement it, and their commitment to implement things and to improve the regime itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Okay, other questions or comments? Okay, well then, I guess if you'll indulge me, I just have a few concluding remarks. The first is I would like to recognize two other authors of the Arms Control Association PGS report who are hiding in the audience. Kelsey Davenport, who's hiding behind the stanchion there, and Jenna Parker. Just wave your hand so you can say hello to everybody. Okay. I also want to thank all of the members of the NSGEG that we have here today and all of the supporters of the group. Thank you very much. Lisa Collins from Asan Institute has been instrumental in getting this convention together, and Anya Lukianova and the Stanley Foundation in their support, Rethink Media, and helping us organize this event. So all of our colleagues and friends, we thank you all very much. Let me just wrap up what I consider to be about 4 or 5 of the main points we heard today. Nuclear terrorism is a real threat, even though we haven't seen it yet. It is clear that the brutality of terrorists really does not know any barrier. There are gaps and serious concerns about the current nuclear security regime that can be exploited. I think that's just a fact, and we have to deal with that fact. And if we leave the summit process without having dealt with that fact, I think it will be a negative legacy of the summit process. The security summits and its gift baskets have made, I think, steady progress to address some of the problems that have been identified. And they've also significantly advanced parts of the regime, including the provision of information. So that's very useful. And if that's not sustained over time, that would be another problematic aspect of the summits. I would much rather that be something which continues on after the summits end. The International Convention on Nuclear Security is a mechanism that can support all of the objectives of the Nuclear Security Summit and drive forward the improvement of the regime. It also supports the broader nonproliferation objectives that the global community has, as well as having significant regional security implications. In general, I would just say that we are at a crossroad point with the summit coming full circle back to the United States from 2010, now in 2016. I think ambition is necessary in order to make progress. And if we don't make progress and we don't have ambition, then we may end up slipping back to where we were before the summits began in 2010. And I can tell you from personal experience that the mid-level bureaucratic mechanism of our government and other governments is not going to be able to shoulder this burden. They are not going to be able to drive progress. So this is something that has to be driven at a political level, and we need to keep a political track alive. And so I think we have a choice. I would be happy if both of these choices could be melded into one useful overall initiative. On the one hand, the summit preparers are looking at institutions and trying to figure out how to use those institutions to absorb pieces of the summit, but not necessarily looking at the summit as a way to make additional substantive progress. On the other hand, we have these 5 priorities, which took a long time, I have to tell you, to get consensus around these 5 priorities of the international group of experts. Not everybody agreed with everyone, not everybody has signed on to them, but it is an overwhelming majority of those who are recognized to be experts that have supported these. So we need the 5 priorities, and we need the 5 working groups or action plans that the summit participants are proposing, and they need to be melded into one achievement. And I think the legacy of this summit could be greatly enhanced if, in fact, several nations took on board this International Convention for Nuclear Security. So with that, I will thank everyone for coming today and thank our panelists for their excellent presentation.